Hey everybody, and welcome to the Growth Experience Podcast. I am your host, Chris Dye. Our hope is that by listening to this podcast, you realize that you have a gift. And by believing in your gift, you can uncover your purpose and have vision for your life. Whether you're listening in your car, at home, or watching on YouTube, thank you for tuning in, and let's go! What's up, everybody, and welcome to episode 6 of the Growth Experience Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Dye. Excited to be here. I know I say that every single week, but this is something I very much look forward to. Reaching out to people that I admire, look up to, things that I think that could benefit the listener. Today, finally, third time's a charm, we've got Brady Gray, Pastor Brady Gray up in the house. And so I'm totally just kidding. I'm thankful that your family's doing well now and that you're able to make it. So I appreciate you being here, man. How's it going?
Man, it's going well. I'm glad to be able to make it, and I don't like having to reschedule either. But yeah,
I know you, and I know that you don't reschedule unless you really have to. So no, it's all good. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Awesome, man. Well, I like to just take a few minutes here at the front. You know, at the very first episode with my mom, I read her entire bio, and I know some other podcasters do that. I didn't like it, and so I've been shaking it up every week just to figure out what the flow is supposed to feel like. And so if you just take a few minutes and just talk about yourself, allow yourself in this moment to flatter yourself, right? Who are you? What are you about?
Man, flatter myself. I'm not supposed to do that. I was born and raised in Southern Ohio, little farm town called West Union. Mm-hmm. Growing up, I had an older sister. She's 5 years older than me, loving parents. I tell people now that, man, my religion growing up was sports.
Yeah.
I played every sport that you could except football because it wasn't offered. And so I went from one sport to the next year round, from 4 all the way to 18.
Yeah.
Decided that I wanted to pursue athletic training, sports medicine, and I thought that was going to be my life and that was going to be my career. So I went to EKU, and from there just decided that wasn't the right call.
Sure.
So jumped into ministry, and I'm sure we're going to jump into that a little bit.
Yeah.
But I've been married to Ashley for 12 years in June. Have a little girl that just turned 6, Ainsley Grace. She keeps us on our toes, as you've already mentioned. Yeah. And
y'all call her your fiery redhead.
Yeah, fiery redhead for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
no, she's awesome.
She comes with all of the good and bad that comes with having red hair, and so she keeps you on your toes.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I love that. And Ashley and I went to high school together. We graduated together from the real OC. Shout out Oldham County, baby. Yeah, that's my heart and soul. Every time I drive through there, I'm like, man, there's just something about Oldham County. Yeah. And I know you've experienced that, and maybe we'll talk about that too. Not sure. Being there actually, I'm sure we will, several months yourself, coming down from Ohio and Alabama and all the places that you've been.
Yeah.
Awesome. So, married. Ainsley is 6 years old now,
yep.
Right? Just had her birthday, same age as my Olivia. Olivia will be 6 here in a couple weeks. Awesome, man. You know, you started to talk about, and obviously we'll elaborate on your background prior to ministry.
Yeah.
How long have you been doing ministry?
Yeah, so I started, it's a hard, tricky question.
Yeah.
I've been vocationally in ministry full-time since August of 2011. We got married in June of 2011, and then I picked up my family 2 months later and jumped into full-time ministry and been there ever since.
Yeah.
Before there was part-time and volunteer and leading in ministry for probably 2 or 3 years before that. So okay. I would say, probably going on 15 years now.
Yeah. Okay. So you have a master's degree in athletic training?
I have a bachelor's of science.
Okay.
And an undergraduate degree in athletic training. And when you graduate with that, you take your national certification. Uh-huh. And when I pass that gives me the certification needed to practice. So I kind of had the choice after undergraduate of, do I go just get a job working at a high school, mm-hmm. or do I pursue a graduate degree, and which was fairly new at that time. It was back in 2008. Mm-hmm. I'm an eternal learner. I love to learn, and so I was like, you know what, I'm going to take 2 years. I'm going to get away, So I actually moved to Auburn, Alabama. I went to Auburn for what I thought was going to be 2 years of a master's degree in athletic training. And it was in that stint that God said, no, I need you to jump out of this and jump towards ministry.
Okay.
So I didn't finish the master's in athletic training, but I did obtain a master's at seminary.
Gotcha. Okay. And so from Auburn, is that when you started to volunteer in ministry?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I wasn't raised in church. I didn't start going to church until I was in high school.
Right.
And so there was a little tiny Methodist church in my hometown that my grandparents went to.
Mm-hmm.
And I would go to their stuff every once in a while just because my grandparents would want me to go. So I would go. And the pastor, when I was in college, the pastor of that church used to be a youth pastor.
Yeah.
And for the longest time, there was always this huge Christian music festival around Lexington called Ichthus.
Mm-hmm.
And he would take a group every year. And when I graduated high school, he thought it was a great idea that I become a chaperone. And so me being like 1, 2, 3 years out of high school, I'm chaperoning middle school and high school students. And so we went on these trips. That's kind of where it started.
Okay.
And that's when he actually mentioned to me, I was brand new in faith.
Mm-hmm.
And he mentioned to me through college, like, man, I think you have a gift. I think you have a calling working with kids, working with students. He's like, you have a way of communicating the scriptural truths that just, man, they get it. And that kind of started the ball in my brain rolling.
Yeah.
And from there, when I moved to Auburn, I knew I wanted to get plugged in. I knew I wanted to volunteer with youth because of that.
Mm-hmm.
So I literally went to a church, the only church that I knew of, the first Sunday I was there, and I passed this big Baptist church. And I'm like, man, I'm drawn to this church for some reason.
Yeah.
So on Monday morning, I called and said, I need to talk to the youth pastor. And
Right.
I have since served as a youth pastor.
Mm-hmm.
And when somebody randomly calls you and says, I want to volunteer in your ministry,
Mm-hmm.
like, I'm at least going to take them to lunch.
Sure.
And so the guy took me to lunch, and he actually became a really good friend of mine. And I jumped on staff as a volunteer and intern, and that's kind of where it started from there.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
So just kind of picking at some little things that I'm hearing that I think are important is that, first of all, you had somebody speak into your life. And like you kind of touched on, you didn't grow up in church necessarily, right?
For sure.
Okay. So then, as you're starting this journey, and can you just kind of speak into how important it is, and I know this will come back around when we start to talk about the Grove, but how important it is for us to speak life to one another and how much that encounter encouraged you to where you are today.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the main lessons we're trying to teach our 6-year-old right now.
Mm-hmm.
She's a sweet kid. Love her to death. She's starting to learn, and honestly, I think most kids do this. But she's our only child, so I don't have any like reference other than her.
Sure.
But she's starting to like mimic other kids,
Mm-hmm.
and so we're having these conversations with her of like, man, other kids say things that don't feel good sometimes, and they don't have a great attitude and all this stuff. But scripturally, God and Jesus tells us that the things that come out of our mouth should be honorable.
Right.
They should be loving. They should be uplifting. They should be encouraging.
Mm-hmm.
And so if she says something that doesn't feel good, that's usually the angle we're coming of.
Mm-hmm.
Was that encouraging? Was that loving? Did that lift me up? Did that? And so like I think it's so important for kids, adults, and everything in between.
Right.
But yeah, I think that's something that, speaking back to that pastor speaking the truth into me, like, I think that's something that we miss. I think that God will often give us messages for people. And I don't let that sound weird, but like, for instance, for him, like, he saw that potential in me and he chose to share that with me, and it changed my life.
For sure. And that's something I've been thinking through lately about just like the people in my life. And even Kelsey, which, we'll have her on the show eventually. I'm going to get you. And I'm excited about us talking about family and marriage and all the things that we've gone through. And the more that I think about our connection and how we got back together, that's a story in and of itself. But the more that I know that God worked through her, right? God works through people,
Sure.
Not necessarily planting exact messages, like telling them what to say to you, but I do believe that he works through people. And sometimes he does give a word for a specific person.
Yeah.
And, the enemy works that way too, working through people, right?
Yeah.
So kind of working off of that side, you started volunteering in ministry. What was your vocation at this time?
Yeah, so at that point in time, when I was in Alabama, I was in Auburn. I can't say Alabama because I did 2 stints in Alabama. When I was in Auburn, I was a graduate student, so I actually was employed as a graduate assistant. Mm-hmm. So I was a GA. I went to school for free for my master's degree at Auburn, mm-hmm. and then I was employed by a local high school. And so I was, from basically 2 p.m. on every day, I was at the high school, and I was the only athletic trainer there for them for all the sports. Okay. Middle school, high school, all that fun stuff. And so that was what I call my occupation at the time.
Right.
So I basically did school all morning. They did all of our classes from like 7:30 in the morning until lunch. Mm-hmm. And then we would go straight to our schools. And there was actually 6 of us we were the first class that started this Auburn University graduate program for athletic training. So there were 6 of us from around the country that came in, and we all went to our respective schools.
Wow.
And so it was a pretty cool setup.
Yeah. I gotta flesh something out just to make sure I'm understanding. So you went to Auburn for free?
Yes.
And in that time decided that you shouldn't be going to school?
For sure.
That's pretty cool.
And that's there's a second time in our life that happened too.
Uh-huh.
So I was getting school for free, and it was about halfway through my first semester of 4 semesters. There's going to be 4 semesters straight to get done. Halfway through my first semester is when God finally said it's time to stop running. Like I knew I was supposed to go to seminary. I knew I was supposed to pursue ministry as a vocation.
Yeah.
I was terrified. I'm like, man, I'm really good. I don't like to toot my own horn, but it just came natural to me.
On the Growth Experience podcast, you get to toot your own horn.
So toot. I felt like I was really, really good at athletic training.
Yeah.
Like I won awards as a student, like top student. It just came naturally to me for some reason.
Sure.
The athletic side plus the medical side, like it was there. Mm-hmm. And so like I don't know anything about church. I don't know anything about being a pastor, but I'm really good at this. I have the potential of making a lot of money, and at that point in time, that was a big deal to me. Mm-hmm. And finally, he just made it miserable. He's like, man, like this is where you should be going. And so I made the decision to actually drop out in that first semester. I stopped the program.
Yeah. Did you get any opposition from anybody that had brought you in, or?
What do you mean by brought me in?
Like just the teachers that you had connected with,
or
the program managers, or whatever.
They didn't make it. It didn't make any sense to them.
Yeah.
But you got to realize that in the Deep South, church is normal.
Yeah.
So when I say I'm feeling called to be a pastor of some sort, like they get it.
Okay.
Because everybody and their brother goes to church in South Alabama. Now, there's a story for another day on that.
Sure.
But so they understood that. They didn't understand why wouldn't you just get through the program, get your master's degree, and go from there.
Okay.
So there was opposition there. There was opposition from the school that I was working at because they didn't want me to leave. And honestly, I stayed. Mm-hmm. I finished out the school year. And so when I left halfway through the first semester, where I was doing classes all morning and then going to the school in the afternoon, I then jumped on staff at that church and worked as an intern with that youth pastor all morning until lunch. And so I basically just replaced it.
Okay.
And so I was able to get some experience. It was an unpaid internship, but I got a lot of great info and experience in that time. So
Gotcha. So, man, that's really cool. I mean, that's like, you can dive as deep as you want to go on that, like you said, maybe another time even having you back on, but just, you can create a whole segment about what does it look like to listen to God. And, that's a sermon in and of itself, or several. I mean, you could search that on YouTube and find who knows how many videos on, how to listen to God. And so you said he made it miserable for you. Like, I want to dive into that because some, pastors or in Christianity, sometimes we talk about like it's all good with God, right?
Yeah.
So, what did that look like for you? How did that feel?
I mean, so once again, it's funny because I'm putting things together. Like it's not very often that I'll sit down and think through kind of like my life story.
Yeah.
it was another time in which this wasn't the only time that happened. So for instance, this time in Auburn, when I say he made my life miserable, it wasn't necessarily miserable, but at that time I was dating my now wife, Ashley.
Sure.
We were long distance. I knew that I wanted to marry her. I knew that I wanted to have a family and have kids. And I started to see, man, this is not a great long-term option, because athletic training, you're there for all practices and all games. It's basically a second shift position.
It's like to equate it to like a coach's schedule, maybe.
More so. Because
yeah.
like wherever a coach would come in for practice and leave right after, or come in for a game and leave right after. And I'm not trying to downplay coaches, because coaches put a lot of hours in.
Right.
I'm there for all of the practices and all the games, plus I'm there for all the treatment beforehand and afterwards.
Right.
So I mean,
off-day treatment, all that stuff.
All of it.
Yeah.
I mean, if I had an injured athlete, I mean, there was times I spent 15 to 20 hours a week with one athlete.
Yeah.
Just trying to get them back on the football field, or trying to get them back on the basketball court, or something like that. So it was just a lot of really long hours, and I started to realize, like, man, I have a lot of freedom in like my morning and early afternoon. But man, that's when typical spouses are working and kids are in school. So like, I'm never going to see my family.
Right.
And so I think that was just that big aha moment for me. Like, man, is this really a long-term thing for me?
Yeah.
And so that kind of pushed it that direction. So then I ended up at the end of the school year. So that was in November of 2008. And then in May of 2009, when the school year ended, and my, not contract, but my obligation internally to that school ended, I moved back home in with my parents, as I kind of figured out, okay, how do I pursue ministry? I had already started seminary online, and I had started those courses, but how do I do this? What does that look like?
And how old were you then?
Goodness, I would have been 2009, so I'd have been 29. No, that's not right. My math is awful. I was born in 1985, so 15, 24. 24. Is that right?
Yeah,
24.
Yeah, that's right.
Because I got married at 25, so it was like 23, 24.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
No, I love that, that's kind of the goal of this show, is to like help people get back into their mind, and maybe that's the growth aspect of it, right?
Absolutely.
Like,
yeah.
So I appreciate, and I said it last week, I'll say it again, I'll probably say it every other week, if not every single week, that there's connection and vulnerability.
Yeah.
And so being able to like kind of wade through some of those weeds of how this happened and stuff, I think is really cool to watch people do that. I literally get to watch you do that, which is pretty sweet.
Yeah.
So you are 23, 24. Now you're living back with your parents.
Yeah.
You're still dating or engaged to Ashley?
Yeah, we were still dating at that time.
Okay. And she is at EKU?
Oh, gosh, no,
just
man.
graduated?
I absolutely robbed the cradle. So at that point in time, she would have been just graduating high school, getting ready to go.
Because we graduated in 2009.
Yeah, getting ready to go to EKU. And so I spent, I think, 6 months at home with my parents. I love my parents. Great home life, but when you've been gone for 5, 6 years and try to go back and live with them again, just not the greatest thing. I was working like 4 or 5 part-time jobs. I was substitute teaching. I was doing some personal training because I had that certification as well. I was doing some personal training. I was working part-time as an athletic trainer with some of the schools.
Yeah.
I was part-time youth pastor at the Methodist Church. Like, I just was doing a lot of things. And because I had no bills, like, financially it made sense, but I had no like insurance. And so I'm like, this is not a long-term option. It's not a good thing. And so I started looking, because once again, I was fearful and didn't know where to go in ministry.
Right.
I was like, okay, let me just find an athletic training job.
Yeah.
In Central Kentucky, because I knew I was tired of being long distance with Ashley.
Right.
And so I was like, I want to get closer. I want to be in that region where I can see her on a semi-regular basis. So I actually got hired on at the Toyota manufacturing plant in Georgetown.
Okay.
Chose to live in Richmond. That way I could be right there with her and see her, and then was driving 45 minutes one way to the plant.
Yeah.
So I worked there for, I think, 2.5 years as an athletic trainer, which makes no sense to most people, but Toyota hired a full medical staff. And so they had everything from firefighters to EMTs, doctors, nurses, hand therapists, physical therapists, athletic trainers. All of the above was on staff on site at all times.
That's really cool.
Basically my job at that point, I really enjoyed it. It was great money. Like,
Yeah.
from a financial, I went from, and it's really funny because part of my story is like, I was very blessed growing up with being spoiled rotten, and I'm still spoiled.
Yeah.
But like, I never had to worry about having a car because like my parents would give me a car or my grandparents gave me a car, whatever it was.
Sure.
But it was never a car I could choose.
Right.
Like, it was always a hand-me-down. And so I told my dad, I went from making, I think it was like $700 a month to when I got the job at Toyota, like I had like a $45,000 salary as a 24-year-old.
Right.
And I mean, that just still blows my mind. Like, I went that big of a jump, and I told my dad, like, whenever I get a full-time salary, I'm going to the car dealership and I'm gonna buy a car.
Did you get discounts at Toyota?
I didn't, because we weren't, and I wasn't an employee of Toyota.
You were contracted.
I was a contractor through actually Walgreens.
Man, come on.
And so I went to my hometown. I actually went home, and Dad's like, "So we going to the car dealership?" And I had forgotten. I told him that. And I said, "Let's do it."
Yeah.
And me being just oblivious at that time, I literally walked in, didn't negotiate, just said, "Hey, here's a car I'm trading. I like this one. Let's do it," and just bought a car.
Gotcha.
And so I got that job at Toyota, loved it, was good at it, thought I was going to be there for a long time, and that's when the miserable came in.
Okay.
Like, I hated my job.
Wow.
Like, I enjoyed the people, I enjoyed what I was doing, I was good at what I was doing. A lot of ergonomics, a lot of overuse stuff is what I was working on. And it's, once again, it came natural to me.
Right.
But I was miserable. I had no reason for it. Like, why in the world am I so miserable?
Yeah.
Well, hindsight's 2020. It's like, because God was wanting me to jump into ministry.
Sure.
And so we got married in June of 2011. And around that same time, I got contacted by another church around my hometown. And I visited their church a couple times. My aunt and uncle went there. And the pastor said, "Hey, I want you and Ashley to come just have dinner with my wife and I."
Yeah.
All right, let's do it. And he's like, "We're looking for a children's pastor." Okay. He's like, "I think it's a good way for you to get your foot in the door in ministry." And I was like,
like children's, like little kids?
Like
or?
babies through 6th grade.
Okay.
And I'm like, okay, let's do it.
Yeah.
And so we did that. I was there for a year. I am not a kid. I'm not a kids pastor. Like, Ashley grew up at Southeast Christian. She attended all the kids ministry stuff. She led kids ministry when she was in middle school and high school. She was on stage, like all this stuff. And she got on me so many times because I literally, like, I didn't know what else to do. Yeah. I didn't have kids ministry. I didn't go to church as a kid.
Right.
So I literally would pull my Bible open and was like preaching to the kids. And she's in the background going, "Stop it." And I'm like, I don't know what else to do.
Right.
And so, yeah, that was our first ministry. And we were there for about a year and very quickly learned, like, this is not where I'm supposed to be.
Yeah.
At that time, felt like my call for the remainder of my life was going to be student ministry. And so, yeah. But yeah.
I gotcha. Yeah, so one of the things as you speak through that I want to speak into for the listener is, like, you know, the Bible tells us, "Do not conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind."
Yeah.
And so one of the things I've said on the show, I think maybe episode 1 or 2, is a book by Trevor Moawad, It Takes What It Takes. And so that's the biblical aspect. And then from Trevor's book, he talks about, like, once your mind is changed by a thought, it can't go backwards.
Yeah.
And so it's funny to hear that, like, so often everybody, even if you feel like you're supposed to be pursuing something, you just stay where you are because, like you just said, you were scared to death.
Absolutely.
And so, like, but a lot of times, you know, where that fear is, that's where the growth happens.
But that thought never goes away.
Right. That thought never goes away.
It never leaves, and it continues to get stronger until you just can't be ignored.
Yep. And that's when you say, and just because I know you, right, when you say, you know, I was miserable and I hated my job, it probably wasn't even necessarily that you hated the job, because you liked what you were doing. You were making good money. You had good benefits. Like, we talked about that on the way up here, right?
Yeah.
But on the flip side of the coin, like, you were supposed to be doing something else.
Yeah, there was this, like, discontent in my soul.
Right.
Like, when I was at work, honestly, that was probably outside of working, like, my first job ever, which was just fun as a high school student. It was probably my most enjoyable job.
Yeah.
Like, they have, because it's Toyota, they have turnstiles with, like, barbed wire fence and stuff around the whole building.
Right.
And you have to badge in. And because when you literally, it's funny, nobody really knows this unless you go. When you badge in and go through the turnstile, you're on foreign territory. You're on Japanese soil when you're in the plant. And so, like, there was this, like, switch in my brain that when I walked in through the turnstile, I was like, oh, all right, I can switch my brain onto work. And then when I badge out and go through the turnstile to go home at night, boom, I can turn it off and I don't have to worry about work
right.
until I come back through that turnstile. The problem is like when I was inside the building, was doing a great job, was getting conversations about being a supervisor, all of this stuff, was enjoying it, was fun. It was the time in which I was just sitting. I was at home, and I'm like, man, something's off. And it's like, you're right. It's that thought of, I'm supposed to be doing something else. I'm going to silence it for a little bit. And then it just got louder and louder and louder and louder and louder.
Because you kept yourself busy at work.
Yes.
Right.
And I finally, I mean, it just got to the point where I'm like, okay, like, if I don't make the jump, I'm going to just remain to be miserable. Like, it's just the way it is.
Yeah. Man, that is so good. And we can dive into that all day long because I'm totally about that. And you've watched, our transformation through some of that stuff as our pastor and friend, more importantly.
Yeah.
But we'll move forward, and maybe we'll again have you back on and dive into that another time.
Sure.
What about, walk me through this again too, moving from Richmond to Oldham County where Ashley grew up. Can you...
Which time?
I don't know. There was 2 times, 3 times.
Oh man, let me count. So Ashley's parents are super gracious, super welcoming. They built their house with the plan of their whole basement being basically an apartment, with the long-term plan of it being like a in-law suite for Ashley's grandma.
Yeah.
So
it's a beautiful home.
So we used it multiple times in short stints. So like when we lived in Richmond, right after we got married, we had an apartment. And then when I took the job in Ohio, I had like 2 weeks after we moved out of the apartment that I had to continue working in Georgetown at Toyota. And so we moved in with them short, like 2 or 3 weeks, where I was just driving from Louisville to Georgetown.
Okay.
So that was the first time. Then we moved to Ohio and lived with my parents for like 2 months until we bought a house. And then we came back. So there's been a couple of those times where it's been like 2 weeks to 4 weeks in transition. But I think the time you're talking about was that long stretch before we moved to Bardstown.
Yeah, before I even get there, forgive me. What the time you lived, I guess after that time from Oldham County, moving to Shepherdsville, doing ministry in Shepherdsville.
Okay.
You got hired as an associate pastor there initially?
No, so let me take a step back. So I was in Ohio as the full-time children's pastor. Then I got contacted, and we ended up moving to Greenville, Alabama, which is South Alabama, right on I-65. Through a connection that I had from the church in Auburn, hired me as the youth pastor / associate pastor at a big Southern Baptist church.
Gotcha.
Loved it. We were there for, I think, 2.5 years.
Yeah.
Was doing good work. Ministry was flourishing. It was growing. We just really, honestly, if I'm being real and vulnerable, like we were never welcomed in. Like we were Yankees, and got called Yankee probably 1 million times in 2 years.
Oh wow!
And so like it very much was like I can fight through with the best of it, but there came a time in which I just looked at Ashley and said, "Listen, like we can push through and we can continue to try to do this." I honestly feel like God wants us just to go back closer to home. And so we decided at that point to start looking at, I didn't want to go back to Ohio, didn't think we were supposed to go back closer to Oldham County. Yeah. So we were looking Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, in that region. And ended up getting hired as the youth pastor at a church in Shepherdsville. Okay. And so I moved in, once again, we moved back with her parents in Oldham County until we could find a house. Yeah. Moved into a house in Shepherdsville. And we were there for about 5 years, I would say, at that church. But it was the first... I started in April as the youth pastor. Easter Sunday was my first Sunday. On November, like the Sunday right before Thanksgiving that same year, the lead pastor that hired me was let go. And so... myself and the children's pastor were the 2 full-time pastors on staff at that time. So we, at that point, shared preaching duties. We were like, I was first and third weeks, and he was second and fourth. Okay. They also put me in the role of the head chair of the search committee. Okay. To hire the new guy, because I was fully content. Like, I'm the youth pastor. We're doing some really cool things. This is me. Yeah. Excuse me. And we had like 200 to 300 applicants from around the world apply. Wow. Long story short, I ended up becoming the lead pastor of the church. I fought it tooth and nail.
Yeah.
We had.
Did you not enjoy it, or did you just feel like it wasn't a right fit?
I, at that point, believed that it just wasn't the right time.
Okay.
Like, for the longest time in ministry, there's been a lot of people that feel like youth ministry was just the stepping stone to lead ministry.
Right.
And for a lot of people, it is. I start with the kids, and then my long-term goal is to get and lead a church.
Sure.
For me, I did not feel like that was me. I felt like God had called me to reach middle school and high school students forever.
Wow.
And so, like, I even told people, like, I have no desire to lead a church. Like, I am called to this age group. And so, like, we had every week when I would preach. Like, I feel like part of my giftings is teaching and preaching.
Yeah.
And every
not
week,
that you feel like it is.
Well, thank you. But for me, like, I enjoy it. I enjoy writing sermons. I enjoy communicating sermons. But, like, every week, half the church would come up. Please put your name in. We want you to be our pastor.
Wow.
Nah, I'm good. I'm with the kids. Like,
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Humbling. I'm good. And my prayer through that was, I started to hear it a little bit, like, okay, God, like, are you trying to do this? Like, is this you? Or is it people trying to push me in a direction I should be going?
Right.
And I said, God, here's what I'm asking. This is kind of like the whole dry wool versus wet wool conversation. Like, if this is of you, if you want me to pursue this, would you send one of the elders? Would you let one of the leaders of this church pursue me?
Yeah.
And none of them came. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to stick right where I'm at. This is where I'm at. I'm content. We'll be happy. We got down to 2 guys on the search committee, and I was leading the search committee. We got down to 3. So we interviewed 6 on video. We narrowed it down to 3, and we wanted to bring them in. And one guy had already accepted a position, so we brought 2 guys in. And one guy came in, he's my favorite.
Yeah.
And I literally, because I was the chair, we interviewed him. He went home. I called him like 3 or 4 days later. And he's like, listen, he's like, I have a middle school student. He's like, I have a daughter that's in 4th grade. They were in Indianapolis region at that time. He's like, it's going to take a very clear message from God for me to uproot my family.
Wow.
And bring them. So he's like, that's not your church.
Whoa.
And he said, that's not a shot at your church. He's like, for me, it's not the right fit. He's like, but I think it's supposed to be you.
Ooh.
And I'm like, bro, I've talked to you like twice.
Yeah.
And he's like, I don't know why I'm saying this. He's like, but that crew looks to you for leadership. He's like, I feel like God wants you to be the lead pastor. And I'm like, all right, what's going on here?
Yeah.
And so we kind of started to walk down that path a little bit in my brain. I'm like, man, is this really what I'm supposed to do? My wife is incredible. My wife has a very strong prophetic gift.
She's pretty smart.
She's brilliant. She's definitely out-punted my coverage.
You and me both, bro.
And I literally went to her and I'm like, am I supposed to be doing this?
Yeah.
And she's like, I don't know. Let's see. Let's pray about it.
Right.
So then we interviewed the other guy. The other guy was, half of the group really liked him. The other half of the group couldn't stand him.
Wow.
And so I called a meeting with like our 10 people, which is way too many people on a search committee, but lesson learned. And literally the meeting ended with like half of us wanting to call him and bring him in, and the other one said, if we call him, we're leaving. And I'm like, so we're just literally sitting in the living room of one of the people's house. And one of the elders is like, Brady, I'm sorry, I'm throwing you under the bus. I think you're supposed to be the guy. And I'm like, you have not said this one time.
One
like,
time until like the final hour, yeah.
And so like everybody else was like, I agree. I just didn't want to say anything because you've been saying that you were supposed to be the youth pastor. And
right, right. I gotcha.
And so they're like, would you consider it? And I'm like,
well, at this point.
At this point, yeah, I will.
Yeah.
And so I literally left because I was like, I'm out of this. Like, if I'm in the running for the conversation, I don't need to be in these conversations.
Right.
And so I left, and I called my wife on the way home. I'm going to backtrack because I didn't mention it to her before, because that was the first time I had mentioned it to her. Like, she had been thinking about it and all this stuff. Okay. And I called her, and I was like, they asked me to pray about being the lead pastor. And she started, belly laughing on the phone. Yeah. She's like, yeah, I knew. She's like, I knew it was coming. She's like, God showed me that that's the path you were supposed to take. He just told me not to tell you. And I'm like, she's very, very wise in her focus is not playing the Holy Spirit for me, but to be patient and letting the Holy Spirit speak to me.
Hear it for yourself.
Yes. And so she's like, I knew it was coming.
Right.
So I jumped in as lead pastor, and was there probably 2.5, 3 years as a lead pastor. Because there was a good 6 to 8 months of in between.
Sure.
Of trying to fill that position.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No, I love that story as I'm tracking through it. And, one of the things that we've been talking about is like you felt like you were supposed to, or, you took this leap of faith from Alabama and you felt like, hey, we need to move back closer to home. And so, as a realtor, even that, working with, Keller Williams and then helping start another brokerage and then back to KW. And people have asked me, like, why are you moving so much? And, I have said now, not then, but now, it's like, I'll move whenever God tells me to. Yeah. And so I love that you had courage in your convictions, because that's where it starts. It's the conviction, right? And once you like start seeking God and understanding what the Holy Spirit is about, like we can't make somebody change, but the Holy Spirit can like, hey. Yeah. And I think that's what's so cool about that specific story diving in, is that it really did take, you had already prayed that prayer. And even still as a human being, when you heard that from the elders, you wanted to continue to pray into that. Yeah. And, that was confirmed for you.
And I think that's, for me, I can only speak for me.
Yep.
But for me, it started with being faithful and trusting God in the little things.
Yep.
And the more that I was able to do that, it became easier and more routine for me to be able to say, okay, God, I trust you in even the big things.
Right.
And so it was like, it wasn't just a jump from this to I'm going to trust you and moving my family across the country.
Yeah, no, you had to taste all of this different stuff, right?
And it was like, hey, we're going to try this. And man, we made bad decisions along the way, and it wasn't of God, and I learned those lessons, but it was very much God, this makes no sense to me. And that probably means it's from you.
Right.
And so, okay, let's do it. And like, we had to try to communicate. Like, my biggest fear in all of this was the conversation that I had to have with my parents when I decided to drop out of my graduate school, walk away from the career that I spent $100,000 in a degree to go do, to go be a pastor, and neither of them were believers at the time.
Wow.
I'm like, I don't want to have that conversation.
Yeah.
Because they were still paying on they would not let me pay on my student loans. They're like, we're paying for your school, and we'll be paying on it for a long time, but you're not paying it. And so here I am. They're still paying on it, and yet I'm going to tell them I'm not even going to use it.
Right. Yeah.
But that conversation was just completely full of God. It was, they're like, if that's what you feel like God wants you to do, you'd be stupid not to do it.
Wow.
So do it. And so, yeah, it's been a lot of little things that then moved to medium things that's been moving to bigger things, which then led to like, man, if you would have asked me 10 years ago, would you plant a church? I would have laughed and said, there's absolutely no way.
Well, absolutely. And that's something that Travis and I talked about last week. Where you are today is a combination of little things, right? They compound, right? From where you started to where you are, yes, that looks like a massive jump. But all these little things in between, like it's one thing at a time, 1% at a time, that's led to this such drastic change of what you're doing now.
For sure.
Cool. So we could be here for like 3 more hours, but I'm going to push us forward into you're in Shepherdsville. Yep. Now you're the lead pastor of this church.
Yeah.
And now you feel called to plant your own church.
Yeah, we could talk for another 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Just in that transition. Long story short, basically, when I took over as the lead pastor, I had never been a lead pastor. I'd never led a church.
Yeah.
Honestly, just had no idea what I was doing. But the benefit and the strength in that was I didn't know what I was doing.
Right. Didn't know what you didn't know?
I didn't know what I didn't know. And because I didn't know it, I was very prayerful. And I was very surrendered to God. I need you to help me.
That's a good word.
This.
Yeah.
The problem is people don't often have that same connection. And so what was in me as surrender to the Spirit of God, lead where we're going, was often viewed as he doesn't know what he's doing.
Right.
And so a lot of turned loose to lead, but with a leash.
Right.
Is the easiest way. And I'm really don't want to downplay and talk bad about the church. But God, through the 3 years, I started to God was challenging me on what the church looked like.
For you.
For me.
Yep.
And just the church in general.
Yep.
Like the Americanized church.
Mm-hmm.
And I started to feel and started to see and started to look into some things. And I'm like, man, what we're doing doesn't line up what I perceive to be what God wants us to be doing in the church in general. And so I started to try to prayerfully roll out, because I learned the hard way that when you're trying to drive something as big as a church, it feels like a ship.
Right.
And you can't yank the wheel on a ship.
Yeah.
You gotta steer it very gently and slowly, or you're gonna make some ginormous waves.
Sure.
And so
I tried, Joker.
Exactly. And so I started to kind of try to roll out some newer ideas.
Yeah.
But the bigger picture in my brain at the time was God was calling me to make a pretty drastic move.
Right.
Which was this idea of, man, we got to break away from meeting in this one space and expect everybody to come to us kind of feel. And he given me this vision of the direction of where the church in general was supposed to go. And I tried to roll it out, and just one block after another of, man, we're not going to do that.
Yeah.
Like, that's not for us. Like, we've tried that. Like, I hated that phrase. Like, we tried that 20 years ago. It didn't work. It was 20 years ago.
Right.
Like, let's try it again.
Sure.
And it seemed like the more I tried to roll out these different ideas, the more reservation and hesitation and rejection that I was getting from the leaders. I was part of the elders as the lead pastor, but was not in me.
Yeah.
Did not feel equal.
Right.
I felt like I was one step below them. So I would go to staff meeting. My staff was extremely strong in vision. Like they would just big visionaries of like, man, we should try this, or we should try this, and we get a lot of momentum and a lot of excitement. And then I would take that to the elders, and 90% of the time it would be like, we don't really want to do that. So then I would have to turn around and go back to the staff and say, yeah, they don't want to do it. And I was that hard in between. And so it was just like, okay, that and a lot of other things led to a lot of frustration between myself and the elders. That grew and grew and grew and grew to the point of like, man, like I am almost done with ministry.
Wow.
Like about to walk away. Started meeting with, I don't even remember how I got connected to him, but started meeting about once a month with Bob Russell. And he would take me to lunch and just kind of mentor me and walk through stuff with me. And I told him, like, I was kind of sharing some of these things, and I told him, I was like, I'm about done.
Yeah.
I was like, I'm about done. I was like, I can very easily step away, go back to athletic training, and try again another time.
Sure.
I was like, but it's like, it's about to kill me. Like, my stress was through the roof. My anxiety was through the roof. Everything was hard. It was around this time when we had Ainsley, which is another story, which adds another level of anxiety and fear into it. But I told him, I was like, I'm about done. He's like, do me a favor. He's like, ask for a 1 month sabbatical. He's like, take 1 month off and truly unplug.
Yeah.
So I did. I preached on Easter Sunday of 2018. And at that point, I had already kind of felt that moving forward didn't really feel like it was supposed to be at that church. And that was my prayer the entire time of, I knew I was supposed to be the lead pastor for that season. Yeah. But I even asked the elders at the time, like, guys, pray with me in this, that if I'm not the guy to lead this church forward, then make that clear, because it's not just a job to me. It's I'll move on. You can bring the guy in that needs to be here. It's not just a job.
Love that.
And so was praying that, preached the message on Easter Sunday of 18, took a 1 month sabbatical, and was meeting with Bob on my sabbatical. And probably 2 or 3 days before that meeting, and a very just heartfelt, like, sobbing prayer time with God. Like, God, why in the world is this happening? Like, I've tried to pursue you. I've tried to be faithful. Why is this so hard? Yeah. I don't feel like it should be this hard. Yeah. Like, ministry's hard, but I don't feel like it should be this hard. Yeah. And very clearly, God gave me this message of, man, this vision is for you. It's just not for them. All right. I can deal with that. What's that mean? Right.
Did you have a sense of like final peace in that moment?
Yeah, that's. I mean, that was one of the things for us through ministry the entire time was we didn't want to just leave when things got hard at any church we were at.
Right.
We wanted to feel released from God.
Sure.
And so I was prayerfully, God, are you releasing us from this ministry? If so, show us.
Right.
And so I had that vision or that conversation with God. This is for you, not for them. Didn't have a clue it meant church planting. Went on my sabbatical, and I literally had to threaten my staff, like, do not call me, like, because I overwork. Like,
Yeah.
I want to be there. I had a hard time separating myself.
Yeah.
And I told them, if as long as the building's not on fire, like, please don't call me.
Yeah.
For my sake, like, I need this separation. And they did a great job. And I met with Bob, and he looked at me, and he's like, bro, I'm going to tell you something. He said, leading any church is hard. And he said, but he said, some churches are harder than others. He said, some churches are pastor killers. And now he wasn't calling this church a pastor killer.
Right.
But he said, some churches are just an environment that kills pastors and kills their ministry.
Wow.
He said, don't let this stint of ministry be a pastor killer. He's like, you have too much in you. And I'm like, all right, God. Like, that's good.
That's the confirmation you need.
That was the confirmation. The message from God of this is for you, not for them, plus that. I was like, okay, it's time. And so I came out of my sabbatical, communicated to the elders, guys, like, I've been asking you for weeks and months. Pray with me about the next steps for this church. I'm sharing with you that this is the direction God has called us. We are supposed to plant a church. Now, planting a church to this church at that time was kind of like a cuss word, if I'm being honest. Like, there had been a couple previous pastors that had left, planted a church in the very near vicinity of this church, and tried to steal the church people.
Gotcha.
So when they heard plant a church, that's immediately where they went.
Right.
And so I was like, I don't know where, I don't know when, it will not be in your back door.
Right.
Like, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, that's good.
But I needed to share that with you because I can't continue to lead this church and this flock of sheep while pursuing this.
Right.
I was like, I very much right now feel like Peter. I feel like God's telling me to step off the side of the boat.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm going to do.
Right.
So we transitioned out, and sure enough, when they communicated it, it was on Mother's Day of 2018 was my last day, and communicated it to the church. But right, wrong, or indifferent, it was asked to be communicated very quickly. And I walked on stage on Mother's Day and said, hey guys, here's what God's called us to do. Today's our last day.
Wow.
It sucked.
Yeah.
Awful. It was like probably one of the worst days of my life.
Wow.
And at the end, when service was over, like, naturally, the whole receiving line of people giving us hugs and handshakes. And I kid you not, when I say 50% or more said, stay close, we're going with you.
Wow.
And I'm like, no, that's not why God's called us to plant a church.
Yep.
Like, that's not what he's calling us to do. And so I knew that there was time to step away. And I knew when God started to talk about church planting, it was like, man, I still very much felt called to the region, but I knew I needed to be far enough away from that church to where it was not convenient for them to leave that church and come to us.
Sure.
So we moved. We thought we were just going to stay in our house in Shepherdsville.
Yeah.
And I was going to get a regular job, a
W-2 job.
W-2 job.
Yeah.
But the housing market got so hot.
Yeah.
That I was like, this was fall of 18.
Yep.
And I'm like, okay.
19, so right after.
And so I'm like, okay, it makes zero sense for us to stay in this house.
Right.
When we can get a good chunk of money for it. And so we sold it for a very good amount of money and moved back in to Oldham County with her parents.
Yep.
And so we spent about a year in that stint with them, going through training for church planting, fundraising for church planting, all of that fun stuff.
Yep.
Before we moved to Bardstown.
Yeah.
And so that's
when you and I connected.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yep. That was a funny story as well. Do you remember the text you sent me?
I don't. There's so many texts I don't remember.
You reached out to me and you said, hey, have you ever been to Bardstown or sold houses in Bardstown or something like that? And I told you, I was like, bro, I've never been to Bardstown a day of my life.
Yeah.
But I feel like you probably already know roundabout where you want to live. I'm just going to help you find it. Yeah. And so anyway, that's another story for another day as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's when we connected. After that, shortly after that, we sat down and talked with you about fundraising for the Grove.
For sure.
Really, and again, we could, like you said, be here for 3 weeks, but for time purposes, give us a quick, if you can, current vision, what we do at the Grove, and then, why you feel like that's so important.
Yeah, so that vision for the Grove we moved to Bardstown in January of 2020 with the plans and hopes of launching our church in September, October of 2020. Well,
yep.
Joke's on us. We moved 6 weeks before COVID hit.
Right.
So that got stretched to launching in April of 21. And since early 2020 to now, that vision and the direction of the church has changed probably 30 times. It's like, and that's the way I explain it to people is, we got the old truck running.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're just tweaking it to make it run more efficiently. And
Sure.
I feel like we've got to that place where the truck's running really well.
Yep.
So yeah, the heartbeat of our church is just authentic community.
Yeah.
Like that's what, before we knew where we were supposed to go, before we knew what it was supposed to look like, God gave us a very clear picture of authenticity,
mm-hmm.
community in homes.
Yep.
Like that was all we knew.
By the way, Ashley said that on Sunday, that a little birdie told her that, hey, maybe we're supposed to be in the house, but
100%.
One thing led to another.
It's funny because like when we finally said, yes, we're going to plant a church,
mm-hmm.
I do what I always do. I start to try to learn as much as I can learn. And so I picked up the book by Francis Chan, Letters to the Church.
Yeah.
Because it was recommended to me.
Right.
That's what I do. I read.
Yeah.
And in the introduction of that book, Francis makes the statement, what if the only thing you knew about church is what you read about in scriptures? You've never experienced, heard, seen anything about what is going on today in churches. Mm-hmm. What if all you knew is what you read about in scripture?
Right.
What would it look like?
Mm.
And it was like a bomb went off in my brain.
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah, that's a big one.
Right.
And so that was kind of the heartbeat for us of, if that is the pursuit, which it should be,
mm-hmm.
what we're currently doing is off.
Mm.
Now, this is not me saying what other churches are doing is wrong, but for what I perceive the church, for the one I'm leading,
right,
it's off.
Right.
And so that paired with this, when I communicated it the other day when we had dinner with a family in our church, because they were asking the same kind of questions, like, man, where did this come from?
Mm-hmm.
Like, talk to us about the path you've been on. I said, man, every church that I've served at up to this point, we've done a good job of inviting our friends and our coworkers to come and join us at church, sit with us at church. We do a good job of that. We do a good job of walking with them to plug into maybe a small group or plug into Sunday school. We walk with them even to the point of accepting Christ as their Lord and Savior.
Sure.
And then even to the point of baptism often. But it's like in our world, we've been conditioned that as soon as that person accepts Christ and gets baptized, it's like, oh, my time with them is done. It's time for you to figure it out on your own. It's time for me to go find the next person.
Sure.
And it was this holy like discontentment in me of, this can't be what it's about.
Mm-hmm.
Because so often I've seen people that they get to that point of baptism, and then the person walks away from them, and they're like, where do I go next? It's like a little puppy.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, where do I go? And often people get stuck at that level of spiritual maturity.
Yeah.
Because they don't have people walking with them.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where, for Ashley and I, our prayer was, man, authentic community. And we honestly flipped the script. Because for most people, for most churches, it's when you invite somebody to what you're doing, where do you invite them?
Church.
You invite them to Sunday morning.
Yeah.
Come to our service. Come listen to our pastor sing. But hopefully that doesn't happen. Our pastor preach. Our worship team lead.
Hey, some pastors are good singers.
I guess that's true. But come and join us at this large gathering.
Yeah.
And then if they get plugged into that, they may get plugged into a group, or they may get all this stuff.
Right.
God flipped it for us. God said that first invitation needs to be to your home. Come to your house. And so for us, from day one, if somebody wanted to get plugged into the Grove, the first thing I'm doing, and I would encourage you, and I have encouraged you, or anybody that's part of our church, if you meet somebody that wants to get plugged into what we're doing, the first thing you do is to take them to coffee or invite their family over to your family for dinner.
Yeah.
That's the connection, the family to family, person to person.
Yep.
Then from there, get plugged into a family group or to a smaller, less overwhelming group. And then from there, they may get plugged into the whole group as a whole, as the Grove. That kind of flipped the script. And it's like from a wide funnel down to small, from small to big.
Right.
And there was confirmation on there for me with when you look at the way Jesus functioned. I mean, Jesus invited people to a personal connection with him, and he had the 12, and then that grew all the way up to the thousands, but he focused on hearing it spread. And so we did that, and for me, between the Francis Chan challenge and this holy discontentment of we're doing something wrong to, man, people aren't really experiencing authenticity. Like when I was at Shepherd's, the church in Shepherdsville, we had a group of church leaders from multiple different churches that just organically gathered once a week. There was just supposed to be a meal and time to lean on one another, because there's something about leading as a pastor or leading at a high level in the church.
Yeah.
It's hard to explain, but people don't love to connect with you on a personal level.
Yeah. Feel like they're being judged or something.
Feel like you're being judged or you're not good enough or whatever it is. All of those are wrong. But that's just that's the high idea across the board. And so we're like, well, let's just create this group with the whole point of being a authentic group for us to lean on one another and walk together. So we had like a worship pastor and his family, and I was leading at this church, and we had another family that did like a parachurch ministry. Another couple, the guy was a bass player for one of the big time worship bands. Like, we all got together once a week, and we ate meal together, and we prayed together, and we just leaned on one another. And honestly, man, that's the healthiest church I've ever been a part of, and it wasn't even a church. And so, like, that opened my mind to
wasn't a church.
It wasn't a church from the stand. Yeah,
right.
The air quote, but it was a church.
Yeah.
And we had that realization of like, man, that was what God created us to do. But how many people have never experienced it?
Right.
Like, we came together with, man, we're going to talk about this tonight. But out of the 4 weeks in a month, probably 2 or 3 of them, we never got to this because something was going on in the lives of one of our people.
Yeah.
And we would just stop and pour into it.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of the breeding ground, for lack of a better term, for what we do at the Grove.
Sure.
And you've experienced that. Like, we have a plan. We
rarely goes to plan.
Rarely do we use that plan.
And it usually ends up way better than the perceived plan, right?
And it's often perceived after the fact. I don't know if you caught this or not, but often, like, if we have a plan and somebody in our group has a struggle or something they're working through, and God says, dig in, and we dig in, what happens at the end of that gathering?
People are changed through that.
People are changed, but that person feels guilty. That person's like, I'm sorry I took all the time.
Oh, for sure. I see what you're saying now.
And then what happes? I'll look at them and say, this is exactly what God wants.
Well, everybody wraps them up at that point.
Yes.
You know, and that's the coolest thing. Like, this past Sunday, you know, we started at 10:30 and everybody left my house at like 1:45 because we just, you know, there was a member of our church who shared his heart that he was going through, and then another member of our church talked about, you know, their testimony through a similar issue, and we just wrapped them up.
And that's what happens when you create an environment that's truly focused on authenticity. When you give an environment where people feel safe and encouraged to share what they're really going through, it happens.
Yeah.
And so that's been a big deal. So when we go back to the vision of the church, there's a long rabbit trail there.
No, it's good.
Authenticity is a big deal.
Yep.
Other things, we don't take ourselves too seriously.
Yep.
Like, when we're together, we laugh, we joke, we don't take ourselves seriously. Jesus is our message.
Right.
Like, we don't play games.
Right.
Like, Jesus is it.
Yep.
People in Bardstown had a hard time when we first got there understanding why we chose to be non-denominational.
Yep.
Because Jesus is our message, period. Right. I'm not playing games. Yeah. And so that's a big deal for us. Rest is a big deal for us.
Yep.
And it's funny, one of the guys, when I started building the website and some of the stuff for the church before we launched, one of the guys that's nationwide and kind of does a lot of work with a lot of different church planners, he's like, bro, I'm going to tell you. He said, I looked at your heartbeats on your website, and he said, it's the first time I've ever seen out of thousands of church that a heartbeat for a church is rest. And he said, but it's so biblical.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, God calls us to rest.
Right.
And I was like, we don't do it.
Yeah.
And so that's a big deal for us, is creating balance in life and rest. Worship's a big deal for us, but worship in all of its glory.
Right.
For instance, how often do we do what most people call worship?
Not often.
Not often. Now, I don't like that. I
Yeah.
would like to do it more.
Right. And we've talked about that.
Yeah.
But
worship as a whole.
understanding, like you even told us when you introduced that concept, that like, hey, worship is not just worship music, right? There's
sure.
other aspects of worship.
There's worship through communion. There's
Yep.
worship through giving. There's worship through serving. There's worship through prayer.
Right.
All of that communion with the Father is an act of worship. So we worship every week.
Yeah.
And it's a heartbeat of mine to teach people that worship is more than just singing songs.
Sure.
And so, yeah, that's a lot of the heartbeats for us. Something
Prayer.
that I've learned. Yeah, prayer. That's a
Yep.
good one.
I got you, bro.
In a way, that's funny, because that's like the message that we have on the website is prayer isn't the only thing that we do, but it's the first thing that we do.
Yep.
We're going to pray first, which is funny because I forgot it. But outside of that, one thing that I've learned over the past year is I've transitioned from preaching a message
Mm-hmm.
to creating an environment, and it was a very hard transition for me.
Yeah.
But rather than preaching, I've created an environment for godly discussion that's saturated in the Scripture.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an environment where all people are expected to bring something.
Right.
All people are encouraged to ask questions, and it's a discovery zone.
Yeah.
What I call it is discovery-based discussion. And so,
Mm-hmm.
like, for instance, one of the gentlemen in our church has been in church his entire life.
Mm-hmm.
He came at the very beginning and then disappeared for a long time,
Mm-hmm.
and then he came back.
Mm-hmm.
And when he plugged back in, it was like 2 or 3 straight weeks, and he looked at me after like the third week, and he looked at me almost with tears in his eyes. He pulled me aside. He's like, "Bro, I want to apologize." He's like, "I thought what you guys were doing was not church."
Mm.
And he said, "But I have never experienced the Holy Spirit, and I've never grown like I grow with when I came and I'm sitting and I actually try."
Right.
And he said, because the problem is he's like, for most people, the pastor will say something. I have a question. What do I do?
Mm-hmm.
He said, best case scenario, I write it down
Yeah.
and try to find a way to ask later. Most often, it doesn't get asked.
Right.
He said, but in the way that we do it, that question gets asked immediately,
Yeah.
and it gets discussed and gets broken down.
Yeah.
He said, that's beautiful.
It's great.
And so what I've learned is one of the biggest heartbeats for us is discovery is a big deal.
Yeah.
Because
In a safe environment to do so
Yes.
is the biggest thing.
and that's like what people will say, well, what if somebody says something wrong? That's one of the funny things. Like,
Yeah.
what if somebody says something that's like not biblical?
Yeah.
Like, bro, I say stuff all the time that's not biblical.
Right.
But for me, the way I view it, or any leader of our church that's guiding that discussion, it's almost like the rails on a bowling alley.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm going to let you run.
Yeah.
And that discussion may get off base, and you may only get one pin,
Mm-hmm.
but you're not going to get a gutter.
Yeah.
I'm going to help you biblically stay here, and I'm going to challenge us to think, and I'm going to keep us here, and I'm going to keep us here, but I'm not going to tell you what it is, because here's the problem that I found, and I thought something was wrong with my brain for the longest time, because even as a pastor, if I went and visited a church and I sat for 35, 40 minutes and listened to a sermon,
Mm-hmm.
and I left 20 minutes after I left, I couldn't tell you a thing the man just said.
Yeah.
Like nothing.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of people like that.
For sure. I think
Yeah.
if the high percentage of people that go to church
Yep.
can't remember anything.
Right.
And I'm like, what is wrong with me? Why can't I remember things? And I think the part of it is what I've learned is I can sit as a pastor and tell you biblical truths.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll say it takes like 7 or 8 times of the same message for it to start to sit in. And that's
Sure.
probably true.
Sure.
But what I found is if I can create an environment that's safe, that lets you discover that truth on your own,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't take 7 times.
Right.
It's like 1 or 2.
Yep.
And so that's our goal. That's what we try to do.
And that's because people are using their own perspectives and
Yes.
their own life
Yeah.
to be able to understand what the Bible is saying or what God's trying to tell them.
Yep.
And it's so much quicker, so much more efficient. You get a higher quality relationship
Yeah.
when you do it that way.
I mean, it's just like with relationships. People will say, like, I want, let's go with marriage, for instance.
Yeah.
I want my spouse to have this idea,
Right.
but I need them to come up with it on their own. So I'm going to, like, plant little things
Yeah.
to see if they can get there on their own
Yeah.
because it means more.
Shots fired. Shots fired. Meow, meow, meow. Look out.
And it's that same kind of thing. Like, I feel like it's quicker to be caught, but it's way more sticky as well.
Yeah,
Like, it
yeah.
stays longer.
That's good. I like that. Cool. Yeah, bro. We could talk about this all day. I love it. But we're going to wrap up.
Yep.
Just such good stuff. This is our rapid fire section. Okay. So I know that felt abrupt, but you'll have an opportunity to reach out to Brady if you want to learn more about what he's talking about, because it may sound like a foreign language, or it may sound like a language you finally understand.
Yeah.
Right? Which that's what it was for us. The minute you told us what the heartbeats were for the church, we were like, we want to be a part of that.
Yeah.
And Kelsey is not an impulsive person, but she's the one who said it first.
Yeah.
Which was really, really cool after we met with you guys. So, rapid fire section, your favorite or your most influential books. Doesn't have to be, religion related, but it can be. Obviously, Letters to the Church is one.
Yeah, so I'm really bad when it comes to like remembering titles and authors or like artists and songs.
Sure.
So I'm probably going to butcher the names of them. Right now, I'm on a pursuit for learning how to help people heal emotionally and spiritually. And so a lot of what I'm reading, I'm in a course right now, a lot of what I'm reading is that right now. So the guy's name's Terry Wardle. Anything Terry writes is like mind-blowing.
Sure.
There's a book he wrote that I just finished called Identity Matters, which highly recommend. It talks about how often we place our identity in something other than Christ. And the quote that he says over and over and over that I truly believe with all of my being is, we can't place our identity as children of God in anything that can be lost. For instance, if I place my identity as a pastor, if I place my identity as a father, as a husband,
as an athletic
trainer, all of those things can and probably will be taken away from me at some point in time.
Right.
How many people do you know, specifically pastors, my identity as a pastor, well, when you retire, what happens? You have an identity crisis. Don't place your identity in anything other than being a child of God.
Yeah.
Because that's the only thing that never goes away.
Terry Wardle, Identity Matters.
Yeah,
you did a study on that with our church.
Yeah, we just finished that last night. And so that's a big one. So that's my biggest ones right now. It's just anything he writes.
Awesome. So we didn't say this necessarily on the pod, but kind of what the idea of the church is a missional church or missional community.
Yeah.
So best advice for new pastors who may hear this that want to or are starting a missional church, now that you've been in the game for a minute, right?
I think the biggest thing is it's such a new idea. It's probably not uncommon for a pastor that's been leading a church in the traditional model to hear this type of model and say, man, that sounds really good, but I don't have a clue how to get in and go anywhere. Like, reach out to me. Like, I'm still very new at this, but I've learned enough to kind of get you rolling in the right direction. The second thing I would say is for those that are pursuing this type of model of missional church, missional communities, micro church, house church, whatever you want to call it, you're going to get kickback from other church leaders, because people that don't take the time to look at it will tell you that it's not biblical. It's not biblical. And it's okay. Pursue what God calls you to do.
Yeah.
Many times over the past year where I've communicated to other church leaders that I had a relationship with, I spent majority of the conversation trying to justify the decisions God had asked me to do.
Yeah.
And you don't have to do that. Just follow what God wants you to do.
Right.
Kind of thing.
Love it. And a fun one, what was your very first W-2 job?
Oh, bro, that's the greatest question ever.
We've had Subway, we've had McDonald's. What do we have fast food?
I've never worked in the food industry.
Okay, we got something else.
Yeah, so my first job was my summer going into my senior year. Consequently, it was the same summer I accepted Christ. I worked at a local campgrounds. So It's called Long's Retreat.
Yeah.
The Long family created this Long's Retreat, and it was a big lake. It had go-karts. It had camping. It had all of these things. I mean, arcade, putt-putt. It was incredible. Big, huge water slides.
Sweet.
And so, I hired on that summer to just do whatever they wanted me to do. I consequently ended up on the go-kart track a lot because I was strong enough to move the carts when they got wrecked, and I was quick and agile at that point enough to get out of the way when a kid tried to kill you.
Right.
My favorite part of that job sounds so stupid.
Yeah.
I loved running the trash route.
Okay.
I don't know why.
As far as just serving, or?
It was fun.
Yeah.
They had 2 trucks. That's where I learned how to drive a manual
stick shift.
Stick shift.
Yeah.
They had an old F-150 stick shift that they didn't care if you ran into anything. And that's how I learned how to drive a stick shift. So that was fun. They also had a Toyota truck that they dented the hood and the top of the car. And like it was like a game to see who could put the most amount of trash on this truck. So like I love, and one of the campers like gave me a T-shirt at the end of the year of like Long's Retreat Trash Man. Like I loved it.
That's awesome.
And so it was fun.
You win this question
so far
for the foreseeable future.
Yeah,
I'm sure. Awesome, guys. Well, thanks so much for tuning into the Growth Experience podcast. We really appreciate it. If you enjoyed the show, please reach out to Brady, and we'll get there in just a second. But also, please review and rate the show. I love just doing it, so whether you rate it or not, I'm going to keep pumping it out because I'm having a blast. This is really fun for me. And at the same time, I feel like it's content that other people need to hear. So rate the show, subscribe to the YouTube channel. It's on all your favorite platforms. We would really appreciate that. Getting there now, Brady, how can people contact you if they have questions?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways. If you want to get a hold of me personally, probably the best way is email. That's Brady, B-R-A-D-Y, at grovebardstown.com. If you want to learn more about what we're doing, you can go to our website, which is grovebardstown.com. Also on Facebook, just search the Grove Church Bardstown.
Yeah.
And you can get a hold of me on the website. You can get a hold of me on the Facebook page, all of that stuff. You can find me.
You're doing some other cool stuff too, which we didn't get to touch on today, but we will.
Yeah.
We will. I know we'll have you back. I appreciate you coming on, man. It's such good stuff. So, yeah, thank you guys for tuning in. And until next time, I'll leave you with this. You have a gift. It's time to grow in it.